Currently, devlogs have been coming out about every week and a half, which accounts for about a weekish of development and a few days of writing and editing a video. But I want to bring that down to a week. Yeah, okay, so we need to talk. So, hey, welcome back to the channel. It's been a good while since I've last talked to y'all, so I wanted to explain where the channel's been going from here and what's been going on in my life. I started this channel as a summer project, and given certain world events, it was the perfect time to hunker down and really get into game dev, something that I'd always loved but never had the time to fully pursue. During the year though, I'm a full-time college student, and that means, like many of you, I'm going back to school for the fall now. First of all, don't worry, I'm still going to be working as hard as I can on the unnamed indie game and devlogging the whole process for y'all to see. I really believe in this game, and I'm not going to let it die in that graveyard of unfinished indie games. But this is a new period for the channel, where I'm going to be doing all of this alongside my studies as well. I want to thank you all for your patience with the rocky devlog schedule while I take time to regroup and adjust. I used to have all the time in the world to game develop and make videos, but now that I'm back to school, that time has shrunk. And it's hard to say how often I can make a video when development has slowed down. On a slightly lighter note though, I also think this could be an interesting transitional period for the channel. I want to start showing off the whole development process, and that might mean showing a glimpse of my everyday life and my college studies, sort of like a half devlog channel, half vlog channel. It's a format that I think has worked for other channels like DevDuck, and I'd love to bring it to my channel as well. So if you think you'd be interested in seeing some more vlog style content on this channel and getting a peek into the whole game development process, which means my life as well, let me know in the comments. I promise I won't knock you if you hate the idea, but I think it could be fun. Anyway, I'm gonna stop waffling now and show off some fun stuff for this video. Come on, you didn't think I'd go 4 weeks without coding some new features, right? So hey y'all, if you're new around here, I'm a solo game developer and full-time college student working on a dungeon crawler with a relationship-based buff system. So the game is half about dungeon combat and half about managing relationships with townspeople, sort of like in Stardew Valley. This week, I've been working on what exactly the relationship-based buffs are going to be. I want there to be a lot of modifiers to your combat that make each dungeon run full of possibilities, with a ton of cool synergies being the core of the fun of the game, like in other popular roguelike titles, where in Binding of Isaac, you have all these different trinkets that do all these sort of cool things. So in Unnamed Indie Game, there's going to be 2 categories for this right now. So I've separated them into buffs, which affect only the player, and then status effects, which can affect any living thing, so that could be the player or the enemy. So first, the buffs. Unlike status effects, buffs can only apply to your character, and I imagine these will be linked to different equipment that you can put on, so maybe buffs could be linked to different armor or charms. These are things that will help modify your character to make their attack stronger. So there are buffs that trigger when your character attacks, buffs that trigger when you hit an enemy with a projectile, and buffs that trigger when your character takes damage. So first I set up a system of callbacks that are triggered each time one of these different events happens. Then each buff script defines behavior for what should trigger during each one of those events. So if something should happen every time the character attacks, that would be an on-attack buff. And if something should happen every time the character takes damage, that would be an on-damage buff. So right now there are 2 buffs that I've implemented. The first is the magic missile buff, and it works with the on-attack method. So it gives players' attacks a 10% chance of shooting out a homing magic missile that deals damage on contact with an enemy. I had a lot of fun designing this projectile to make it look all glowy and magical, and I really like the end result. I also made this projectile phasing, so it travels through terrain, like rocks and trees, so I think this will make for some pretty interesting combat scenarios where you could like hide behind rocks and shoot at enemies using your magic missiles, but it doesn't do enough damage to make it viable to just do this all the time, so it just gives your attacks a little bit of extra oomph if you need it. The second buff is the lifesteal buff, which works with the on-hit method, which means it triggers every time an enemy takes damage from one of your projectiles. The buff manages how much total damage you've dealt, and once you've dealt 50 damage in total, your attacks create a red lifesteal orb that travels back to you and heals you for a small amount. So, since it scales with the amount of damage that you deal, it doesn't really matter if a weapon has a lot of projectiles or only a few projectiles. As long as you're dealing damage, you'll be getting healed. So overall, I think these buffs provide a lot of variation to the gameplay loop of killing things and getting loot, so each dungeon run should feel fresh with all the different buffs you're getting and all the different ways that they might synergize with each other. So for example, the magic missile deals damage, and that feeds back into the lifesteal buff, which heals you. So I'm interested in seeing how all these interactions will make the game more fun overall. If you have any ideas for buffs that trigger when you attack or when you take damage or when the room finishes, for example, you should let me know in the comments. Alright, second is the debuff system. Now, I did write a really messy debuff system that uses coroutines and a bunch of other really wacky code, but I wrote this a long time ago when I was still really novice, and it can show if you want to pause the screen and read this code. I don't really recommend it. So I deleted all of that and started fresh with an object-oriented model. So this involved a lot of behind-the-scenes work, but basically I had to retrofit two systems for taking damage, which is the player damage and the enemy damage, into one general system. Now this should have been pretty similar in the first place, but like I said, in the early stages of this project, I was still a very novice developer, so I had to take some time now to pay back the shortcuts that I took earlier. The important thing is that enemies and players now have the same system for taking damage. So I was able to implement a poison debuff that deals damage to enemies and players in the same way. So the poison status effect is the first status effect. It deals an amount of damage each second for a certain duration, and it can stack up to 3 times. So if you hit an enemy with a poisoned projectile 3 times, 3 separate ticks will happen each second that deal a small amount of damage, and if you stack poison to a lot of enemies, it ends up dealing quite a bit. Adding new status effects after the first was pretty easy, so then I added 2 more. The first is a slow debuff that stacks up to 3 times as well. Each stack slows the enemy movement by 15%, and when their movement is slowed, their projectiles slow as well. So for enemies like the Lumi, which shoots out a ton of projectiles, if you slow them, it'll actually make all their projectiles slower as well, so that you have a little bit of extra time to dodge. And finally, there's the weakness status effect, which gives an afflicted enemy or player plus 50% chance to take a critical hit when they take projectile damage. So it's a buff that works with a sort of critical hit build. So this buff required a little bit of extra work because I had to make a special pop-up text that is bigger and orange to indicate critical damage, and implement a whole system for taking critical hit damage. But after that was implemented, I was super happy with it, and I think it looks really cool. This also means that projectiles in general have a small crit chance, like 5%, which causes them to deal double damage. I think this could open up some interesting avenues for different types of weapons that focus specifically on a critical hit build, like a sniper type weapon which has a really high crit chance, but maybe are slow to reload or very difficult to aim. Also, if you may have noticed, I experimented for the first time with writing shaders so that all these debuffs made enemies look different colors, which I think is sort of like a badge of honor for a game developer. Like now I can say that I've finally written my own shaders. Like, I always felt like shaders were this really scary tool that only true game developers knew how to use, but honestly, after following some tutorials, it's really not too difficult. Especially working with Shader Graph, it made the process really approachable, and hey, now I know how to write some simple shaders. This one changes an afflicted enemy to be whatever color the status effect is. So for poison, that's purple, for slow, that is light blue, and for weak, that is this like light orange color. But it doesn't actually shade the outline. So the shader colors everything inside the outline and ignores the outline, which is a subtle difference, but honestly something I just did to get some practice with my new skill. The Lumi on the left is using the shader, so the outline is not actually shaded that purple color, but the Lumi on the right is just using a general shader, which colors the whole thing. And I think the one on the left looks a tiny bit better. Anyway, yep, that's the new buff and status effect system. The larger motivation for these systems was to provide more player choice in how exactly you want to customize your run. So everyone can play each run completely differently and customize it to how they like to play. So if you want to play a super safe playstyle, where you use ranged weapons and slows to keep your enemies at a distance, or maybe you want to play like a dangerous melee brawler who uses lifesteal to keep yourself safe in the midst of combat, I think these are all choices that will make the game more fun and more customizable for the player. Now I am sort of worried with these 2 new systems in the future about feature creep. These systems alone are going to require a lot of different buffs and status effects to make the player choice interesting, and combined with a very robust weapon system, that's a lot of individual things to design and code. I'm still experimenting with how I'm going to design around this. I may have to limit the weapons pretty significantly so that the buffs and the status effects take center stage. But for the time being, I'm just putting that in the back of my head, and for next devlog, I'm going to be fleshing out the game's town area some more to balance out all the work that I've been doing to make the dungeons interesting these past 4 weeks. So the game's supposed to be half town exploration, half dungeon running after all, so I've got to give the town some love. Anyway, thanks for sticking around, y'all. Like I said, it's hard to say when the next video is going to be coming out, but I really want to hear your opinions if y'all are interested in seeing a little bit of my life outside of game development as well. But I'm going to be working as much as I can alongside being a full-time college student to make this game happen. Wishing you all the best. See you soon, hopefully, and as always, thanks y'all.